Hello, I made this animation recently that is using Stardust to create a voxel grid and using a texture map to apply across this grid while we use physics to animate them by connecting some fields to sound keys and playing with the values. And it gets kind of a pretty interesting result. I had a few people ask me about this one, so I thought that maybe we could kind of do a quick walkthrough of my scene and then maybe do a fresh setup to kind of walk through any nuances of why I set it up that way. So first things first, let's jump in. Let's look at the scene. It looks a little complex, but let's walk through each part and try to make sense of it. Let's jump to a custom view to look at our scene setup. I have this set up like a tabletop. So I have a floor and I've created my grid just right above that floor so that when they fall, they kind of hit the floor and then kind of react with the forces. I have a spotlight up above, illuminating them with some fall off. And that's kind of like the base setup. My emitter is set to grid once, 0 speed. And my grid size is set to my composition size. And my grid X and Y amount is connected to my particle size. So one thing to note is that the resolution of the image is based on the density of your particles. So here I have more particles, 50-40, which gives more surface quality or surface area to apply the texture to, so you get a higher resolution looking image. If I were to lower this by half and increase my particle size, you'll see that I have a much lower resolution image based on having a sparser grid and bigger particles. So just keep that in mind as if you're recreating something. If you're recreating like a logo, obviously you would kind of want some more fidelity there. So maybe you have a denser packed grid that you're applying it to. But also keep in mind that the more geometry that you're simulating, obviously it's going to get a bit heavier. So I'll continue with this lower amount just so that we can kind of do RAM previews and see what's going on. So I have my particle is set to model and I have it set to a long life, and that being set to model, I have a model connected to it. That model is set to primitive, and that primitive is a cube 1 by 1 by 1 with 1 by 1 by 1 segments, and there is no bevel. And there is a material assigned to that. For the surface quality, I have the reflection and roughness parameters. I've dialed them up. Actually, the reflection is turned off. It's just the roughness, which affects like how intense the specular is, whether there's a big fall off or more of a metallic look. And I have my physical node connected to, oops, I skipped over the color map, which is up here at the top. I've put the field in between the emitter and particle so that the texture is applied once when the particle is born, rather than having it be constantly applied as kind of like a projection if you move the field below the particle and attach it just to the particle rather than sandwich in between. This creates a more interesting look of where the texture is mapped and then it is kind of distorted and kind of eroded away, rather than it kind of constantly, like in the animation example I shared, where the animation or the texture is persistent over the animation. And under maps, I have it set to layer. I have a image, which is the size of my other composition. So I have it set from emitter, and the layer size, or sorry, the layer is set to sample quality high, color over length doesn't matter. I have it set to color, and project along the X and Y, apply axis X and Y. And I have the field rotated -90 because I rotated my grid -90. Perfect. And the next node is the physical node. This basically, these two at the bottom are the new ones, physical and forces, and they are chained together. So your physical goes to the particle and your forces go to the physical, unless you were doing like global, like if you wanted these to affect multiple systems, you could not link them or direct link them like all of the other nodes. And here I have this set to dynamic, simulate using model, and that is that. And down here I have my plane, which is a primitive set to twice the amount of my composition size. And under model properties, I've also rotated this -90. If I make the material of this not black, we can see it. There it is. You can see the shadows from the spotlight above. And I also have a physical node attached to this that is set to kinematic, so that it is not moving around, it is only collided with, and it also is set to simulate using model. So with that said, I also need to, since I made my particle size bigger, if I just increase the position of the plane, so right now I had it offset in the Z10 since my particle size was smaller, but now that I have a bigger particle, let's just maybe make that a little bit further away so that it's not immediately colliding with it. And then you can kind of see that the animation is working out still. Cool. So that is kind of a quick overview of the nodes involved and how it's set up. Let's jump into a new scene, try to rebuild it from scratch a little bit, get something close. At least that way we can walk through the process, and hopefully this makes a little bit more sense, or you have more questions. To be determined. Let's make a new comp. Let's call this our pixel grid test. 24, it's 1000 by 1000, 300 frames is probably enough. Let's make a new solid. Let's call it Stardust. Apply Stardust. Make another solid. Call it our background. Move it to the bottom and go forward in our animation, and we see that we have particles from our Stardust. Let's make two things. Let's make a camera. This is probably, let's just do like 50. And let's also add in just a null and turn it to a 3D layer. And let's move to like a 3/4 view. Excellent. So the null will serve as a world coordinates for us. So let's look at our grid. Our grid, we're going to set to emit once and 0 speed. And we know the size that we want is, we're going to want this in our X and Y. So let's do 1000 by 1000. And let's set our particles in Z to 1. Cool, that's our basis. So if I were to rotate this -90, I could go back in my camera and I could get a pretty close to, top down view like our other composition. Cool, right now the particles are set to a short life, so let's increase that and change them to models. Let's drag in a new model and material. By default, it's using a cube if there is no file, so let's set that to primitive. Change the primitive properties to be a cube 1 by 1 by 1, and again, we don't need any segments, so we're just going to set that all to 1. Let us create a field, and let's make a, can I break the connection here? Maybe. There it goes. Let's put it in between the emitter and particle. And let's make a duplicate of our image that we were using and set that to match our composition settings. Fit to comp, close that, and drag that into our composition. Let's hide it because we don't need to see it. And let's go back to our field. Let's set this to maps, layer, and our layer source is image 2, and let's set that to high. We don't need color over life. Let's set it to color, project in the X and Y, apply axis X and Y, and let's rotate it -90 because we rotated our grid -90. And there you go. It looks like it's applying it. Let's go back to our custom view, get our 3/4 view, and let's make our particles bigger. Let's do 40. I think that's what we had in our previous scene when we lowered them. And let's increase this to 20. Oops. 20 by 20 in our grid. Cool. So let's go to our render settings. Let's turn on ambient occlusion so we can get a better idea of the spacing. I'm just going to turn on AO blur. It softens it out. And let's make a floor. We'll also need a material for that as well. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to the model. We're going to change it to primitive. We're going to change our primitive properties to be a plane. We're going to do twice the size of our comp settings. So we're going to do 2000. And we're going to change the model properties to rotate in the -90 as well. There we go. You'll notice that it is at 0, 0, 0 as our R cubes at 0, 0, 0. So we need to offset one of these so that they are not intersecting. So I'm going to choose to do the emitter instead of the floor on this. So let's do the floor up, the emitter up. They are 40, so let's do 40. Oops, not in the Z. Let's do this. The Y, oops, I went wrong. Oh, we will eventually get there. Let's do 460, which is 40 pixels less than we had. Cool, so we're gonna hit save on this. I'm actually gonna increment and save because I have another version of this. And let's start looking at the physics. So first things first, if I don't mess up my camera a million times, let's get back to our kind of default view. We're going to go up to our settings up here under render settings, and we're going to turn on physics. It is off. We're going to set the simulation quality to medium. Since we're dealing with boxes here, this isn't too dramatic. If you're dealing with something that has more information and you're starting to see interpenetration or things that don't look like they're kind of in proper physics, you can always adjust the simulation quality, knowing that the higher you go, the slower your simulation will be. And the other setting that you can adjust is your margin threshold, which is the kind of bounding box size around the objects. So this lower will give you, closer collisions, and by default 40 value I find is pretty good for most instances. If you find that you are kind of really zoomed in on something and you're seeing a lot of detail, maybe you might want to increase that. And then in tandem with the simulation quality, and find what works best for you. Just for trying to keep this fast, I'm going to keep it at medium and the default of 40. And the other note is if you're working in an untitled scene, before you turn on the simulation, it will ask you to save because it is going to create a cache of the animation where your scene file is saved. It'll create a subfolder in there. So you'll need to do that you'll need to hit save before you turn this on. So let us add these two nodes at the bottom are physics and not fields, but forces. So if we add our physical directly to our particle and we add a physical to our model, we can adjust these. So we will want to set our floor down here to be a kinematic, not dynamic, set to model. And our physical, our boxes we will set to simulate using box and dynamic. And if we hit RAM preview on that, you'll see that they fall, collide, and kind of move around. I find that this is often too low of a quality for me, so I'm going to set this to model as well. And if we hit run preview again, you'll see that they kind of more behave like we expected them to. They fall and just kind of settle there. Since they don't have like a lot of bounce or there's no forces right now, they're not really moving around, they're kind of just sticking to where they land. Cool. So now that we have physics in for both of our objects and our animation is in place, the last thing that we're missing is our force, which is right below it. I'm going to connect that directly to the physical node. And let's just set this to be spherical, and let's give it like a negative swirl amount of like 15, and we want it to swirl in the Y and maybe like 50 amount. Let's just go for 100. Oh, maybe 50 is good. You'll see that everything is kind of being sucked in towards the center, and they are swirling around the axis. Pretty cool. Next, we will add in another force, and this one we will set to be a spherical. Let's give that random and this one a random. Let's maybe set this one to 25 as well, and maybe that swirls in the opposite direction. Positive. Play that, and then we can kind of see how our two fields are reacting to each other. It's pretty cool. Interesting. Obviously, in my previous render, I had 3 spherical fields being driven by audio, so there was kind of like these randomization happening. So we can kind of just emulate that if I just add like a, let's say, a noise, not a turbulence. Create or attach that to our physical as well. Let's create noise and noise type. Let's create a flow. Let's maybe make it pretty big. So let's say 350. Let's lower our frequency to maybe 8. And let's give it a lot of speed. So it's constantly evolving. So let's say like 25. And if we turn off, well, we'll leave both the other two forces on and see what that looks like. We'll notice that nothing is happening because we forgot to set our actual amount. So let's maybe do like 50. Go back to frame 1 and we'll see that we've created a mess. And then now you'll see that that noise is kind of affecting them and making them move through that turbulence. And then the swirl kind of has a greater effect. So maybe we need to turn down our swirl amount, maybe like 15 for 1 and maybe 5 on our positive. There we go. Our swirls are kind of keeping everything together while our noise is doing a more dramatic breakup. You'll see that our floor isn't big enough, so they're kind of hitting the edge and kind of sliding off. So the other thing we can do is maybe go to our floor physical settings and maybe we just turn up the friction really high and damp the forces. And kind of keeps things a little bit more together, but that noise is still pushing them pretty far away. Either way, let's now add a wiggle to that noise so that it could kind of simulate what we were doing with the audio. So let's just go to the amount. We're going to alt click that and type in wiggle. Let's maybe do like, I don't know, every 8 frames. Let's maybe wiggle by, where are we at, 50? 50 is fine. And just for kicks, let's go ahead and just make our floor bigger. Let's do 2500. Just to get more room, let's go to our active camera. And you'll notice that our first frame is blank, so by default the particles are being born on frame 1, so I like to just go to frame 1 and trim the composition to work area. There we go. Now we have our particle grid being born and getting kind of mashed up. Pretty cool. Obviously there is a lot of potential here. I could increase this to match our original size if I did 40 by 40 and lowered our particle size to 20, maybe 22. Much more fidelity, still animating pretty fast, and it's pretty cool to see how it all jumbles up. If I set our floor color to not be a bright white, maybe drop this down to a dark purple, desaturated dark color, and we set our color from particle to 0, we'll get something like that. Looks a little bit better. And the last thing that we're missing is I like to add in a light. So if we go back to our custom view, I like to normally just add in a point light. And then I like to position it where I want it, sitting centered above our grid, maybe a little bit higher. And then I change that to spot. Maybe bring in our cone. Maybe our cone is a little crazy. Give it some vignetting and maybe set the fall off to, I think that's probably a good size since we're like 1,000. 800 is almost all the way to the edges. And make sure that we have shadows turned on. And when we play this, when we go back to our active camera, see that it looks the same, but it has shading. But if we go up to our Stardust settings and turn on shadows, bam, get a little bit of cast shadows from each of the cubes onto themselves. Gives it a bit more depth. And we have animation that looks closer to what we created before. That was me trying to fly through this. I know it's pretty dense to kind of like gloss over a lot of these settings, but hopefully walking through my setup and then kind of building it from scratch offers some insight into it and how to create this effect. Look forward to what you guys do with it. But obviously there is a ton of potential. That image source could be animated. Your particle types could be all different kinds of things. You can now randomize particles based on one source. So if I attach multiple models to this, you could go to your model and set it to be random instead of just all, cubes. There's definitely a lot of potential that you can do. In the newest update, they've also added the ability to do a force that is connect. So it'll actually create connections between each of these objects and kind of keep them together, whether that's kind of like chain based or spring based. It's pretty fun to play with. That adds a completely different dynamic. And yeah, so the last note that I will say is that if you are happy with your physics simulations and you just want to adjust like your lighting and your texture and everything, the way that Stardust works, the way that I was saying earlier, that it's creating those cache files. Let's say I was gonna just do 100 frames of this, trim my comp to work area. As you ran preview, it is creating a cache for each of the frames. And if you're happy with that cache, then you can freeze it. So let me just let this finish real quick. Hit OK. And once you set this to freeze, it's not calculating the physics anymore. It's only just updating any of the animation changes. So say like you went in and changed what this texture was, I can just bring in a animated sequence, something I rendered the other day. let's bring this in, but let's try tone this real quick so that we don't have black. Just do some crazy colors. Red, purple, teal. What else would we do? Maybe that red is too intense. Maybe it's like blue. Great. Jump back out. We see now that jump back out to here. Oh, we see that we made those changes in the wrong pre-comp. So that was a great example. Let's add that to here. And we see our animation changes, reflects that change. That's cool. So now you can adjust things like that. You can add a replica and let's say stack these in the Z or something if you wanted. Now that you're maybe negative. There you go. Maybe we just rotated these slightly. And the X and the Y. You could add a replica to this now that it is not calculating the physics and it updates really fast, and you're able to kind of like up the amount of particles that you have in your animation pretty quickly, rather than having to wait to calculate all that. But you would want to hook this replica up to that particle so that you weren't replicating anything else in case there was anything else in your scene. So cool. So hopefully that extra tidbit there at the end pushed us to almost nearly 30 minutes, but hopefully that is insightful. And again, I'm learning this just as alongside all of you are. It's always exciting to see the updates and what they're adding. There's a lot of features here. There are also some other great tutorials out there. Hopefully this answers a couple of questions regarding that specific animation I made. And again, if you have any comments, leave them below and I will try to answer if I can. If they're too technical, you should definitely hit up the Stardust team. They have a great support system. And also on AE Scripts, the ticket system there is a great way to get technical trouble as well. Wish you the best until next time. See you later.